They said it couldn't be done. They said a unit of black soldiersmen who had been deemed unfit for combat, men who had been relegated to the shadows of the greatest war in human history, could never execute a military operation. So audacious, so impossibly precise, that it would leave even the most hardened white commanders speechless. But on a fog-shrouded morning in November 1944, in the muddy, blood-soaked fields of eastern France, those same dismissed soldiers would prove that courage has no color, and that heroism often emerges from the most unexpected places. This is the story of how one forgotten black unit liberated the French town of Château-Salins in just 24 hours, using a plan so wild, so unconventional, that military historians would later call it either brilliant madness or mad brilliance. But for the men who lived it, who bled through it, who watched their brothers fall in those terrible hours, it was simply survival. It was proof. It was everything. The 761st Tank Battalion. Even their designation sounded like an afterthought, a bureaucratic footnote in a war machine that stretched across continents. They were called the Black Panthers long before the name would carry different meanings in different times, and they wore that title with a pride that bordered on defiance. These were men from Detroit in Alabama, from Chicago's South Side and Mississippi's Delta, from Philadelphia's streets and Louisiana's backroads. They were mechanics and farmers, college students and laborers, united by the color of their skin and the weight of a nation's doubt pressing down on their shoulders like artillery shells waiting to drop. They had trained at Camp Hood in Texas, where the summer heat felt like punishment and the winter cold cut through their thin barracks like contempt. They had endured the sneers of white officers who believed black men lacked the intelligence to operate complex machinery, lacked the discipline to follow orders under fire, lacked the courage to face death without breaking. They had swallowed that poison daily, had felt it burn in their throats with every segregated meal, every separate latrine, every reminder that they were soldiers of a democracy that didn't consider them fully human. But Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates was different. He was a white officer who looked at his men and saw soldiers, not statistics. He was a West Point graduate who had actually volunteered to command a black tank battalion when other officers treated such assignments as career suicide. He stood before them in the Texas dust, and he told them something that would echo in their minds through every battle to come. He said, "I don't care what color you are as long as you can fight. We're going to war, and we're going to show them what you're made of." Some of the men didn't believe him at first. How could they? The trust had been beaten out of them by a lifetime of broken promises, but Bates didn't just speak the words. He lived them. He ate with his men. He inspected their tanks personally. He fought for their equipment when the Army tried to give them obsolete Shermans while white units received the latest models. He became something rare in that segregated army, a bridge between two Americas forced to fight as one. By October 1944, the 761st had finally been deployed to France. Arriving in the port of Le Havre after white units had already pushed deep into occupied territory, they were attached to General George S. Patton's Third Army, and there, in a moment that would become legend, Patton stood before the assembled battalion and delivered words that carried both challenge and recognition. "Men," he said, his voice that famous bark that could cut through artillery fire, "you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." The words were vintage, Patton rough, profane, politically incorrect even by the standards of 1944, but to the men of the 761st they meant something crucial. They were being given a chance, just one chance, and they knew with absolute certainty that they could not afford to fail. Their baptism of fire came quickly, brutally. They were thrown into combat near the town of Moyenvic, attached to the 26th Infantry Division, and immediately they found themselves in the hell that was the Metz-Sarreguemines campaign. The weather had turned savage cold rain that turned roads into rivers of mud, fog that reduced visibility to arm's length, a bone-deep chill that made every movement agony. The Germans were dug in deep, fighting with the desperation of men who knew their homeland was next. And they had 88mm guns that could punch through Sherman armor like paper. They had Panzerfausts in every hedgerow. They had veteran troops who had survived the Eastern Front and considered American soldiers soft, untested children playing at war. The 761st learned fast that war was nothing like training. It was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, an Oklahoma native with a smile that could light up the darkest nights, who showed them what courage looked like when the bullets started flying. Rivers commanded a tank named Cool Stud, and he fought with a ferocity that seemed to defy physics. When his platoon came under heavy fire near Gebling, when other tanks were retreating to regroup, Rivers charged forward, his 75mm gun blazing, drawing enemy fire away from his brothers. He took out 3 German positions before withdrawing, and when he climbed out of his tank, his uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and his hands were shaking with adrenaline. "We showed them," he said to his crew. "We showed them we can fight." But it was in mid-November that the 761st received orders that would define their legacy. The town of Château-Salins sat like a cancer on the Allied advance, a strategic position that controlled key roads and rail lines in eastern France. The Germans had fortified it heavily, turning the medieval town into a modern fortress. They had positioned artillery on the surrounding hills, they had machine gun nests in every building, they had mines carpeting the approaches and anti-tank guns sighted on every road. American forces had probed the defenses for days and been repulsed each time with heavy casualties. Infantry units had tried frontal assaults and been cut to pieces. Artillery had pounded the town until the ancient stones crumbled, but the Germans remained, entrenched and defiant. The conventional wisdom said that Château-Salins would require a major offensive. Weeks of siege warfare, thousands of casualties. The conventional wisdom said it was impossible to take quickly, and that's when someone at division headquarters had an idea that bordered on insanity. They would send in the 761st Tank Battalion. They would give them 24 hours. They would see what the Black Panthers could do when given the impossible. Captain David Williams received the orders in a bombed-out farmhouse that served as battalion forward command. He was a Howard University graduate, a man who had studied engineering before the war, who understood mechanics and mathematics and the terrible calculus of combat. He spread the maps across a splintered table and studied the terrain while rain hammered the roof like machine gun fire. Château-Salins sat in a valley with hills on 3 sides, a tactical nightmare for attackers. Every approach was a killing ground. The Germans had observation posts that could see for miles, could call down artillery fire on anything that moved. The town itself was a maze of narrow streets where tanks could be easily trapped and destroyed. Trying to punch through the front would be suicide. Williams stared at those maps until his eyes burned, until the contour lines blurred together, and then he saw it. He saw the wild plan that would either make them legends or get them all killed. There was a secondary road, barely marked on the maps, that wound through a forest on the southern approach. Intelligence said it was heavily mined, said it was impassable for armor, said the Germans considered it a non-threat and had only lightly defended it. Williams looked at that road and he thought, that's exactly where we need to go. The plan was born in that moment, refined over hours of frantic discussion with his officers and NCOs. They would split into 3 elements. A frontal force would make a noisy demonstration attack from the east, drawing German attention and artillery. A second force would circle around to the north and threaten the town from that direction, forcing the Germans to split their defenses. And then, just before dawn, the main assault, forced 12 Sherman tanks and a company of infantry from the attached white unit would punch through that impassable southern route and hit Château-Salins from the one direction the Germans weren't expecting. It was crazy. It violated doctrine. It depended on speed and surprise and the enemy making mistakes. It required the tank crews to navigate in darkness through potentially mined terrain while maintaining radio silence. It required split-second timing and absolute trust between units. When Williams presented the plan to Lieutenant Colonel Bates, there was a long silence. Bates studied the maps, traced the routes with his finger, calculated the odds in his head. Finally, he looked up at Williams and said, "If anyone can pull this off, it's us. Do it." The men of the 761st spent that evening preparing for what might be their last night alive. Sergeant Samuel Turley, a Louisiana native who had been a truck driver before the war, wrote a letter to his mother that he sealed and left with the chaplain. He wrote about the cold and the fear and the brotherhood he had found in his tank crew. He wrote that he was proud to be serving, that he was fighting for a future where his younger siblings might not have to face the same hatred he had endured. He wrote that he wasn't afraid to die, but he was terrified of dying without making a difference. Across the camp, 19-year-old Private James Harrison cleaned his machine gun for the 3rd time, his hands moving with mechanical precision while his mind raced through scenarios. Harrison had lied about his age to enlist, had walked away from a sharecropper's life in Georgia with nothing but the clothes on his back and a desperate need to prove himself. He had been assigned to Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers' tank crew, and he worshipped Rivers with the intensity that only young men at war can muster. Rivers found him that evening, saw the fear barely concealed behind the brave mask, and sat down beside him on the cold ground. "You scared?" Rivers asked. Harrison nodded, not trusting his voice. Good, Rivers said. Smart men are scared. Fools think they're invincible. You just stick close to me tomorrow, do your job, and we'll all go home. It was a lie, a kind lie, because Rivers had no idea who would survive the next day, but sometimes kindness is more important than truth. They moved out at 0200 hours in darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. The demonstration force roared toward the eastern approaches with headlights blazing and guns firing, making enough noise to wake the dead. German artillery responded immediately, shells screaming overhead. Explosions lighting up the night in hellish orange flashes. The northern force engaged next, their guns adding to the cacophony, their radio chatter flooding the German listening posts with noise and confusion. And in that chaos, 12 Sherman tanks crept along the southern route like ghosts. Their engines throttled back, their crews holding their breath every time a track clanked against stone. Captain Williams rode in the lead tank, standing in the commander's hatch despite the danger, straining to see through the darkness and fog. Every shadow could be a mine. Every shape could be an anti-tank gun. His mouth was desert dry and his heart hammered so hard he was certain the Germans could hear it. Behind him, the other tanks followed in single file, maintaining 10-yard intervals, each commander watching the tank ahead for the flash of explosion. That would mean they had hit a mine, and the mission was over before it began. The forest pressed in on both sides, branches scraping against hulls, roots and rocks threatening to break tracks. It took them 2 hours to cover 3 miles. 2 hours of pure terror moving at walking speed through potential annihilation. They emerged from the forest just as the first gray light of dawn began to dilute the darkness. Château-Salins lay before them, perhaps a mile distant, its medieval silhouette rising from the valley floor. Smoke from the ongoing artillery barrage on the eastern side drifted across the town like funeral shrouds. Williams could see German troops moving through the streets, reinforcing the eastern defenses, completely unaware that death was approaching from their unguarded rear. He lifted his radio handset, broke silence for the first time in hours, and spoke 3 words that would launch the attack. Panthers, we go. 12 Shermans exploded into action simultaneously, engines roaring to full throttle, tracks churning up mud and grass, 75mm guns traversing toward targets. They covered that mile in perhaps 5 minutes that felt like 5 seconds, speed and surprise, their only armor against the response that was coming. The lead tank driver's cool stud crashed through a wooden fence and into the outskirts of town before the first German shot was fired. Then all hell erupted. A Panzerfaust round screamed from a second-story window and missed Rivers' tank by inches, exploding harmlessly against a stone wall. Rivers' gunner, Corporal George Mason, swiveled the turret with practiced speed and put a high-explosive round through that window, silencing the threat in a shower of stone and flame. The tanks spread out now, moving through the streets in coordinated pairs, each covering the other's blind spots. The infantry dismounted and began clearing buildings, kicking in doors, throwing grenades, engaging in the brutal close-quarters combat that turns towns into meat grinders. Private Harrison manned his bow machine gun, firing in controlled bursts at any movement, his earlier fear burned away by pure adrenaline. German troops tried to mount a counterattack from the town square, a desperate rush with machine guns and grenades. But they ran straight into interlocking fields of fire from 3 Shermans. It was over in seconds, a horror show of bodies and blood that Harrison would see in his nightmares for the rest of his life. They pushed deeper into town, taking casualties now. Sergeant Willie McCall's tank took an 88mm round through the turret, killing the loader instantly and setting the ammunition on fire. McCall and his surviving crew bailed out into a hailstorm of small arms fire, running for cover behind a burning building while their tank cooked off in spectacular explosions behind them. Technical Sergeant Charles Barbar Sherman threw a track rounding a corner too fast, leaving his crew stranded and vulnerable until another tank could tow them clear under fire. It was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers who became the embodiment of the 761st's fighting spirit that day. His tank seemed to be everywhere at once, smashing through German positions, drawing fire away from damaged American tanks, his gun hammering out round after round with mechanical precision. But just after noon, as they fought to secure the main square, an 88mm round found cool stud. It struck the lower hull, penetrating the thin belly armor and exploding inside the crew compartment. Rivers felt something slam into his legs with the force of a sledgehammer, felt the wet heat of blood soaking through his trousers, felt his body trying to shut down from shock. His driver screamed and the tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. Harrison, in the bowgunner position, was drenched in hydraulic fluid and blood, his ears ringing from the explosion, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Out. Everybody out. Rivers roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. The crew evacuated through hatches while German rounds pinged off the hull like deadly rain. They dragged Rivers out last, his legs mangled below the knees, blood pumping from severed arteries, his face already gray with blood loss. A medic appeared from somewhere, Private First Class James Thompson, a Detroit kid who had been pre-med before the war, and he went to work with morphine and tourniquets while Rivers gritted his teeth and refused to scream. "How bad?" Rivers asked. Thompson's face told him everything. "Bad enough that you're going to the aid station," Thompson said. Rivers shook his head weakly. "No, not until we take this town. Not until the mission is complete." Thompson looked at him like he was crazy, but he also understood. This was what they had come to prove. That black soldiers could fight, that they could lead, that they could bleed and die with the same honor as any white soldier in this man's army. Captain Williams found them there in the bloody chaos of the square, found Rivers propped against a wall with tourniquets on both legs and that impossible smile still on his face. "Sir," Rivers said, his voice thready but determined, "get me into another tank. I can still fight." Williams felt something break inside his chest, felt the weight of command and brotherhood and impossible choices pressing down on him. He knew Rivers was dying, knew that moving him would probably kill him faster, knew that any competent officer would evacuate him immediately. But he also knew what this mission meant, what they were fighting for beyond military objectives. He nodded once sharply and ordered Rivers loaded into Sergeant Turley's tank as an extra crewman. Rivers would spend the next 6 hours fighting from that Sherman, calling out targets, directing fire, his blood slowly draining away while he helped clear the last German positions from Château-Salins. He would die that night in a field hospital, his legs too damaged to save, his body too traumatized to survive. But in those final hours, he would be everything that command had said black soldiers could never be: courageous beyond reason, dedicated beyond measure, a leader who inspired by example and sacrifice. By 1400 hours, the main square was secured. By 1600 hours, the last German positions on the northern ridge had been overrun. By 1800 hours, exactly 16 hours after the attack began, Captain Williams stood in what remained of Château-Salins Town Hall and Radio Division headquarters with 3 words: "Objective secured. Panthers victorious." The response was stunned silence, then a burst of frantic questions. How had they done it? What were their casualties? Was the position really secure or just temporarily held? Williams answered each question with growing satisfaction, with pride that had been earned in blood and fire. They had done the impossible. They had taken a fortified town in less than a day using a plan that military doctrine said couldn't work. They had done it with obsolete Shermans and hand-me-down equipment. They had done it while carrying the weight of generations of doubt and discrimination. They had done it because they were soldiers, because they were the 761st Tank Battalion, because they were men who had been told no their entire lives and had learned to turn that into fuel for their fire. The cost had been terrible. 11 men dead, including Rivers, who would succumb to his wounds that night. 23 wounded, some so badly they would never fight again. 3 tanks destroyed completely, 5 more damaged and requiring extensive repairs. When the men finally had a moment to breathe, to process what they had survived, the full weight of it crashed down on them like artillery. Private Harrison sat in the ruins of a cafe and wept openly, his hands still shaking, Rivers' blood still staining his uniform. Sergeant Turley found him there and sat down beside him, not saying anything at first, just being present in that vast silence that follows battle. "He was a hero," Harrison finally said, his voice breaking. "Sergeant Rivers was a goddamn hero." Turley nodded slowly. "They all were. We all are. And maybe now they'll start to see that." But even as he said it, he knew the truth that every black soldier in that war understood in their bones. They could be heroes 1,000 times over, could bleed and die and win medals and glory, and they would still go home to a country that made them sit in the back of buses, that denied them the right to vote, that saw their skin before it saw their service. That was the bitter truth that made their courage all the more remarkable. They were fighting for a future they might never see, for a freedom they might never enjoy, for the hope that their children or grandchildren might live in an America that finally lived up to its promises. The liberation of Château-Salins should have been a turning point. The 761st's action should have been splashed across newspapers, should have been studied in military academies, should have earned them the Presidential Unit's citation they so clearly deserved. But in November 1944, in a still segregated army and a still segregated nation, the story was largely buried. Official reports were written in dry language that stripped away the heroism and focused on tactical details. The credit for the liberation was often attributed to white units that had provided support. The wild plan that had made it possible was considered too unorthodox to be held up as an example. And most painfully, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers' Medal of Honor recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross, then quietly forgotten in the massive bureaucracy of war. He would not receive the Medal of Honor until 1997, 53 years after his death. After a comprehensive review of military records revealed the systematic racism that had denied black soldiers their earned recognition. By then, most of his comrades were dead, unable to witness justice finally being served, unable to tell their stories to a nation that had finally begun to listen. The 761st Tank Battalion would go on to fight for 183 consecutive days in combat, one of the longest continuous combat records of any unit in World War II. They would participate in the Battle of the Bulge, would help liberate concentration camps, would fight their way deep into Germany itself. They would earn 391 decorations, including 1 Medal of Honor, 11 Silver Stars, and 69 Bronze Stars. They would prove beyond any possible doubt that courage has no color, that honor knows no race, that sacrifice in the name of freedom is universal. But perhaps their greatest victory came in that 24-hour period in November 1944. When they took a fortified town that everyone said was impregnable and showed the world what black soldiers could accomplish when given the chance, when trusted with the responsibility, when allowed to fight as equals even if they weren't yet treated as such. Captain David Williams survived the war and came home to an America still deeply segregated. He marched in civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s, wearing his uniform and his medals, daring anyone to question his right to equality. Private James Harrison became a teacher in Atlanta, spending 40 years educating black children, telling them stories about the men who fought not just against fascism abroad but against racism at home, who proved that dignity could not be taken away even when rights were denied. Sergeant Samuel Turley went back to Louisiana and became a truck driver again, but he carried the memory of Château-Salins with him every day, carried the knowledge that he had been part of something larger than himself, something that would echo through history, even if history was slow to acknowledge it. These were not perfect men. They were human, flawed, capable of fear and doubt and mistakes. But in the crucible of combat, in those terrible hours when death was a constant companion and courage was the only currency that mattered, they showed what the human spirit could achieve when pushed to its absolute limits. The town of Château-Salins still stands today, rebuilt from the ruins of war. There's a small memorial there now, installed decades after the battle, honoring the American soldiers who liberated it in November 1944. For many years, that memorial made no mention of the 761st Tank Battalion, no mention that it was black soldiers who had accomplished what white commanders had deemed impossible. That has changed slowly as the full story has emerged from archives and fading memories, as historians have pieced together the truth that was buried beneath layers of prejudice and bureaucratic indifference. French citizens who were children during the liberation have shared their memories of seeing black soldiers for the first time, of being liberated by men their own propaganda had taught them to fear or despise, of learning that heroes come in every color. One elderly woman interviewed in the 1990s remembered a tall black sergeant who had given her a chocolate bar while shells were still falling, who had smiled at her with such kindness that it had shattered every racist lie she had ever been told. She didn't know his name, couldn't identify him from photographs, but she remembered his humanity, and she wept telling the story 50 years later. This is what gets lost in the dry historical accounts and the tactical analyses and military statistics. War is experienced by individual human beings, and heroism is measured not just in military objectives achieved, but in moments of grace under impossible pressure, in kindness shown when cruelty would be easier, in the determination to remain human when everything around you is designed to strip away your humanity. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion understood this in ways that soldiers in more privileged positions never had to. They understood that every action was being judged, that every mistake would be attributed to their race rather than their individual failings, that they carried the weight of representation on their shoulders along with the weight of their equipment. They understood that they were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against Nazi Germany, one against American racism, and that they could never afford to lose either one. That double burden would have broken lesser men, that it didn't break them, that they instead rose to heights of courage and competence that even their own commanders had doubted they could reach, is a testament to the strength of the human spirit when properly motivated and finally given a chance. The story of Château-Salins, like so many stories of black soldiers in World War II, is a story of excellence achieved despite every possible obstacle, of heroism proven in the face of constant doubt, of men who fought for a country that didn't fully accept them because they believed in what that country could become. It's a story of a wild plan that shouldn't have worked but did, executed by men who shouldn't have been fighting but were, resulting in a victory that should have changed everything but took decades to be properly recognized. It's a story that needs to be told and retold, not just as a historical footnote, but as a central narrative in understanding both World War II and the long, painful journey toward racial equality in America. Because every time we forget these stories, every time we allow them to fade back into obscurity, we do a disservice not just to the men who lived them, but to everyone who came after. Everyone who benefited from their sacrifice, everyone who walks in freedom because others were willing to bleed for it. The fog is lifted now, both literally and metaphorically. We can see clearly across the decades to that. November Day in 1944, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion rolling toward an impossible objective. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers bleeding out in a tank turret because he refused to leave his men. Captain David Williams standing in a liberated town hall knowing that everything had changed even if nothing had changed. Private James Harrison crying in the ruins because he had survived when so many hadn't. We can see the full truth of what they accomplished and what it cost them. They were not fighting for glory or recognition. They were fighting because it was their duty, because their brothers needed them, because somewhere in the future their children and grandchildren might live in a world that judged them by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. They were fighting to prove what should never have needed proving, that they were men. They were soldiers, they were Americans, they were human beings deserving of respect and dignity and the full rights of citizenship. They won that battle in 24 hours in a small French town that most Americans have never heard of. The larger war would take much longer. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. These men fought with extraordinary courage in the face of both enemy fire and home front prejudice, and their legacy deserves to be remembered and shared. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear what this story means to you. What questions you have, what other forgotten heroes you'd like us to honor. And please subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you these real stories of black soldiers, pilots, nurses, and heroes whose courage changed the course of history but whose names were written too often in invisible ink. They fought for us. The least we can do is remember them. The 761st Tank Battalion's motto was "Come out fighting." They did, and they won. Never forget.